I was with my two brothers at the time. We had ventured into the swamps located about 20 miles south of Nacogdoches, Texas. This area, known as Bayou Bodcow, is teeming with wildlife, including deer and beavers, which we were hunting. While following some beaver tracks, I got separated from them. So I decided to head back to our campsite since it was starting to get dark. While walking through the swamps, I could hear something moving around in the trees nearby. However, I couldn't see anything due to the thick foliage. I just assumed it was an animal or one of my brothers trying to find me. But then this strange feeling came over me, like something wasn't right. That's when I heard a loud crashing sound coming from behind me, followed by what sounded like heavy breathing and snarling mixed together. The closest thing that comes to mind would be the sounds big cats make on television. I froze in place. Whatever it was kept making those noises off and on again for several minutes until finally everything went silent. I waited for a while before slowly turning around. To my shock, I saw what looked like a giant man standing behind me, about 50 yards away. Despite the dense growth, this thing stood up straight, almost touching the tree branches above its head with ease. Its skin appeared blackish brown, but it was still human rather than animalistic. There was no hair, except for small patches covering areas such as the chest and shoulders, where veins bulged slightly beneath their surface. Yet it seemed soft, almost transparent somehow, probably because light didn't penetrate much further down than the epidermis itself, which is so thin compared to ours. We made eye contact briefly before this thing started running toward me at full speed without breaking stride, which terrified me to say the least. I turned and ran myself faster than I ever thought possible, not looking back once. Even though I felt the hot breath closing upon my neck moments later, I only stopped after reaching another clearing several hundred feet away. I was sure I was far enough ahead to escape its sight. Somehow, I could hear the same heavy footfalls keeping pace, despite how quickly I put distance between us. Eventually, they stopped altogether, however, leaving silence broken only by the normal night sounds of chirping insects and frogs croaking. Those things usually help reassure during times of fear, don't they? Anyway, I walked the rest of the way back to camp using my flashlight. Now, although I knew the chances of seeing anything else were pretty slim, since the moonlight helped illuminate the ground sufficiently, also my natural caution increased tenfold thanks to my recent experience. I did not want to take any more unnecessary risks if they were avoidable, hence my desire to err on the side of caution whenever possible, which ended up serving me well later. Moreover, I was kind of freaked out about the whole encounter, knowing my family likely wouldn't believe my story, especially considering that there was no real evidence to support my claims. They would probably think I was joking, crazy, or both. Perhaps even worse, they would dismiss it outright, thinking I was attention-seeking or lying. They didn't care about the fact that it might actually be true, simply because they were unable to comprehend it themselves. Anyway, that's my experience. Take it or leave it for what it is. I have no proof or explanation for what I saw, and my friend also witnessed it, but he didn't see as much as me. This took place on August 21st, 2021 in Columbia County, New York. I was walking back to my friend's house from a store at about 9:30 p.m. Through some tall grass, I noticed movement off to my left side. It appeared that the grass was being parted by something very thin that moved quickly, about 4 feet up from the ground. It moved away from me into a wooded area, then stopped moving, so I thought maybe it just ran into the woods and hid behind a tree, but when I walked past where it had been, there was nothing there at all. Then suddenly, there were 5 quick knocking sounds coming from somewhere nearby in front of me. This was followed by an immediate loud bang sound. It was like someone threw something hard against the wood. This seemed to come from far above me, higher than any trees around. There are no houses or people anywhere near this location for miles. My first instinct is usually curiosity rather than fear. So instead of running away immediately after hearing these strange sounds, which would have probably been smart, I started trying to look for whatever made them. The sounds sounded almost exactly like someone knocking on a door, except way too fast and repeated many times within seconds. Now, thinking back on it, it was more like if you dropped a stack of plates onto one another. They were kind of high-pitched, hollow clanks. As soon as this happened, though, everything went silent. There were no crickets, no bugs, and not even wind, just complete silence. I stood still, listening intently with all senses heightened, scanning everywhere. I was trying to figure out what direction these sounds came from, hoping they'd happen again. In retrospect, I'm sure most people's fight or flight reflexes would have kicked in full gear and made them run home or inside, but I genuinely wanted answers. At this point, things get hazy and really confusing. My eyes feel heavy and start tearing up, making it hard to focus or think clearly. My head starts pounding and I hear the ringing fade out. But just before passing out completely, everything feels very fuzzy and blurry. Off the trail, I see something glimmering ahead, slightly higher up than myself. It looked directly at me but had no face. It had long, thin arms and legs, culminating in elongated fingers and toes. It had a pair of wings, unlike anything I'd ever seen. They seemed holographic and iridescent, glistening with every color imaginable, kind of pearlescent. I don't recall how many limbs, to be honest. There was some form of telepathy happening between us. When I was asked, "Do you want to join?" before I could respond, I was grabbed forcefully and tightly by the shoulder, wrist, or arm. I was pulled upward somehow, magically, invisibly. Everything faded to black. The next thing I remember is waking up at sunrise and lying down on the trail, cold, sore, naked, and covered in dirt, dust, and grime. I was wearing someone else's clothes, and all my belongings were gone. My backpack, gear, shoes, bike, everything, and there were no footprints, marks, or traces on or around where this happened. So, yeah, I don't know what happened. Hopefully some genius here can help explain. Entro emboao. I am a 22-year-old man, and I have been an avid outdoorsman since the day I could walk. My friends, family, and I are always out hunting, fishing, or just hiking in the woods of East Texas. However, about 3 years ago, my cousin and I were on one of our many hunts for hogs near Houston, Texas, when we encountered something that still haunts us to this day. We had set up camp at around noon. We pitched our tents, ate lunch, and then headed off into the thick piney woods of southeast Texas with our bows ready, looking for any sign of a hog. We came across some tracks by a small pond, but they weren't like any other tracks we'd seen before. They were more human-like, but only slightly larger than ours. We knew these couldn't be from bears because black bears don't get much larger than 5 feet tall while standing upright, and grizzlies aren't found anywhere close to where we live. So there was no way it was coming from them. Naturally curious as young men are supposed to be, I decided to follow them. The trail led downwind, which made me uneasy because if you hunt enough, you know most animals stay upwind from whatever they're stalking. Then, after about 200 yards of following it, I saw it. A huge black creature was digging through some roots behind an old oak tree. It must have been 9 feet tall, at least. My first thought was, wow, that's the biggest damn bear I've ever seen. So I immediately got on my hands and knees, hoping he didn't see me. But when he turned his head towards me, not only did I realize he wasn't a bear, but I also noticed that his eyes shone red as blood, even though there wasn't any light shining directly in his face. I pulled back slowly, trying not to startle him, but then I stepped on a branch which snapped like thunder. He turned quickly, using lightning-fast reflexes. His ears pricked forward, and he growled deeply. At this point, I'm thinking, oh crap. I dropped my bow, grabbed one of the arrows instead, nocked it, and waited for him to charge. Once again, I stepped back slowly without turning away. He stared at us for what seemed like 2 hours, eventually getting bored, lowering his head, and taking slow, deliberate steps until it disappeared behind another tree. By now, the sun was starting to go down. As soon as night fell, we sprinted at full speed all the way back to camp, grabbed everything, left, making sure to leave nothing behind, pack it up the tent, jump it in the truck, and took off, never stopping until we reached the nearest town. Since then, neither one of us has gone out alone. Since then, I've learned that these things are called skinwalkers. They were once humans who practiced black magic and/or cannibalism in an attempt to become one with the animal spirit. The only way to kill one is with a silver bullet or knife. They roam the woods at night, searching for anything they can eat or kill. The encounter I had wasn't nearly as bad as it could have been, seeing as we escaped unharmed. But if you're ever out hunting, fishing, hiking, etc., make sure you keep your eyes peeled, because there's no telling when you might run into one of these creatures. In 1996, when I was about 13 years old, my family and my friend's family went camping at the Delaware Water Gap National Park in Pennsylvania. We planned a long weekend trip during August, although I can't recall the exact date. The campground was situated right along the river, separated from it by a vast open field approximately 50 yards wide. It was also located atop a small mountain range that divides Pennsylvania and New Jersey. We had set up our camp early on Friday afternoon. As was our tradition, we made dinner over an open fire, cleaned up afterward, and settled in for the night. I'm not certain of the time when the following events occurred, but I would guess it was somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m. Our tent was located about 15 feet away from where my friend's parents were sleeping, so they heard everything too. At first, all we could hear were heavy footsteps to our left, which would have been to the west if you were looking at a map. Then there came this low, guttural, moaning sound that still gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. It sounded like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. Suddenly, something big started making its way through the tall grass, heading south towards the river, which is east of where we were lying inside our tent. I can tell you one thing, whatever this thing was, it didn't move like any bear or deer does. It moved slowly yet deliberately, even though there must have been a pretty thick brush hiding its movements. Every once in a while, I'd hear branches breaking underfoot or see bushes being pushed aside without actually seeing anything doing these things. This entire encounter lasted only a few seconds, really. As soon as my dad shined his flashlight out into the darkness, trying to find out what was going on outside, he scared away whatever it was. This left us alone again, at least temporarily. I'm just glad we never had to come into contact with it face to face. In the early 90s, I was driving home from college one evening. It was wintertime in western Oregon, and it had been snowing off and on all day with light flurries that evening. As I drove down this long, winding country road that led to my house, which is about a mile out of town, I saw something cross the road up ahead of me. I slowed down because I thought it might be an animal crossing, but as I got closer, whatever it was, it crossed into a farmer's field next to where they were keeping some cows for beef. What I saw shocked me at first. Although many people live near this area, it's not exactly out in the sticks. There are only 3 houses along this particular stretch of road, and most people around here have their yards well lit or have motion activated lights. Even so, nobody really goes outside after dark if they don't have to, unless you're going somewhere. So when you see something crossing your path, like what happened here, you tend to take notice. So when whatever this thing crossed over into the pasture or field on my left-hand side, about 50 feet away, just as I approached, I could make out very distinct human-like features. It had a tall, bipedal body shape with large arms and legs. It had longish hair that appeared white, blonde, or gray in color, hanging off its head down past its shoulders. It had a slightly hunched posture and a human face with facial hair covering the chin and lip areas. I'd estimate its height to be between 6 feet and 6'5" judging by how much taller it was than the fence post tops and those plastic lane markers we use to divide lanes of traffic. It took about 3 steps to cross the road. At first, I didn't know what to think other than trying to figure out if someone had decided to get dressed up like Bigfoot or Elvis Presley and go running around Oregon country roads during blizzard-like conditions late at night. Why wouldn't he, she, or they stay inside? The whole event took place over a few seconds while I was slowing way below the speed limit, then coming to nearly a complete stop in front of our neighbor's house, allowing for a very close view. This would become a more unsettling moment later, after getting back onto the paved driveway and traveling the remaining distance before reaching the garage door, thinking, what did we just see? Both of my parents had already gone to bed by the time I got home, so I figured I would wait until morning to tell them. Then again, maybe it was a better idea to go straight to my room and try to sleep in it. Once safely indoors, I spent the rest of the night lying awake trying to process the events. I just kept replaying it in a loop, mulling through the possibilities and reasons. After what felt like an eternity, I finally managed to drift asleep. I was awakened several hours later by my mother screaming and shaking us, yelling, "Wake up! Did you guys hear anything last night?" Before replying, I asked her a question. Years later, my brother, sister, and I reminisced about the occurrence. The conversation turned to sightings, and we discussed our memories. It brought back a vivid recollection of mine and theirs. As siblings sharing individual experiences, we remembered that right afterward, none of us dared mention it to anyone. We were afraid of ridicule, dismissal, and judgmental labels as paranoid attention seekers, so we agreed to remain silent. Only now am I able to share publicly without fear of alienating family and friends or risking. It was late September of 2005. I had been up in the mountains for a week with my friend Jason. We were on our way back down to Denver from Rocky Mountain National Park when this happened. We had stopped off at one of the campgrounds. I'm not sure which one exactly, but I think it was close to where you can see Twin Sisters Peak in Estes Park. We set up our tent there and went to bed early since it got dark so quickly at that time of year. I woke up around 3 in the morning because something just didn't feel right. I looked over towards Jason, who was still sleeping soundly, but then I noticed what looked like two large, glowing red eyes staring straight back at me through his open tent window. My heart began racing as if someone had given me an adrenaline shot right into my chest cavity. Pure fear coursed through every fiber within my body. As soon as he opened them again, though, they vanished completely without leaving any trace behind. It was almost like nothing ever happened. Then all became eerily silent once more. After seeing those orbs, I thought about waking him up immediately, but instead, I decided against doing so until morning came along anyway. This was mainly due to how much sleep deprivation could negatively affect us both at such high altitudes. And also because deep inside myself, there was always that lingering question, what did I just see? Later on in life, whenever somebody mentions anything related or even remotely similar regarding paranormal activities or strange occurrences anywhere throughout America's vast landscapes, whether naturalistic ones such as forests and jungles or man-made urban environments, rest assured that yours truly will be paying extra attention indeed. My brother and I grew up in the Northern California mountains on our family ranch, which has been there for generations. The closest town is Hayfork, California. If you're familiar with it, then you know how isolated it is out here. I'm 22 now, but I was around 11 or so at the time of this event in 2009. During summer break, my brother, who was 16, my cousins Jake, who was 12, and Johnny, who was 14, and I were hanging out at their house, which is about a mile from mine. Their house sits along a creek right before ours does. Jake came running to me saying, "Cass, come look, we found some footprints." And of course, being an 11-year-old kid who loved animals as well as anything mysterious or supernatural, I went along with him to check them out. He led me back behind his house, following these large human-like footprints through the thick underbrush until we reached what looked like a deer carcass lying across a log overhanging one of the creek's deeper holes. The log crossed between two steep banks, probably 15-20 feet apart. We didn't really think much of it since we figured someone must have just shot it and left it there. As Jake showed me more tracks going in different directions throughout this area, he pointed out that whoever killed the deer also took its head. It seemed very odd because most hunters don't take everything after they've killed something. At this point, both of us kids were starting to get spooked by all these weird things happening around us. However, we were still curious enough not to leave yet. We decided instead to go tell our older brothers because obviously whatever made those tracks could possibly be close by. My brother brought his .22 rifle, thinking maybe he would shoot off some rounds into nearby trees, thinking that might scare off whatever was lurking. About halfway back down towards Jake's home, near another small hole in the creek bed, there lay an even bigger buck carcass, without its head either. Now feeling very uncomfortable, we quickly started jogging or running again further toward their place. As soon as they got sight of each other, my brother raised his gun and shot off 3 rounds above its head. Not realizing any connection between those events or hearing them previously, all 4 of us boys ran scared away from each other. Everyone thought that thing looked almost exactly like Bigfoot when it was described correctly. So far, nothing else strange has happened while staying at my cousin's place. Later in life, though, I ended up marrying into the Cree Nation, a sub-tribe. One day, her uncle stopped by to visit everyone for a while traveling through. Somehow, the subject came up, After telling him every detail I remembered about the incident, including how far gone everyone thought my brother must have been, he looked me straight in the eyes, deep within my soul. Then he simply stated, "Yep, that sounds pretty typical." Then he got up, walked outside, picked two good-sized rocks, sat down, placed one inside his palm, folded his fingers around it tightly, shifted his weight, gripped hard with his right hand, and twisted firmly. It broke the stone into tiny pieces. He immediately threw the fragments onto the ground, held his hands together again, and repeated the process in exactly the same way. All 4 times he succeeded completely. The next time I asked why he had done such odd behavior, he responded, "I told the Great Spirit your story. In return, I offered proof." In the 1970s, my dad was a young man. He grew up in the backwoods of East Texas. He would tell me stories about some weird stuff that happened to him out there when he was growing up. The most bizarre thing happened one night while he was walking home from work. It was around 10:30 p.m. on October 1st, 1975, near Dayton, Texas. He had just gotten off his shift at an oil refinery outside Houston. There, they produce jet fuel for commercial airliners and diesel for trucks and cars. They do this by refining crude oil into gasoline. This gasoline can be used as a power source or even put directly into engines without further processing, although this is very rare. As he walked down an old dirt road towards our house, he was surrounded by dense woods. These woods were like fortress walls protecting their inhabitants against whatever might lurk beyond them, including Sasquatch. Suddenly, he heard something moving through the trees beside him. He couldn't see anything due to the darkness of the late night. This didn't seem unusual since animals are always making noises out here. This is especially true during certain times, such as mating season, when they get pretty rowdy. They try to attract mates with loud calls, etc. However, what caught my father's attention more than anything else were 2 glowing red eyes. They were staring right back at him from between branches and overhanging shrubbery all around. At first glance, Dad thought it might have been nothing more than reflections coming off nearby car headlights. People do drive along these same roads sometimes, even though it's pitch black dark. Then again, why wouldn't other drivers have stopped already if they too noticed this strange sight before now? That's when things started getting really scary, though. The next thing you know, those 2 sets of bright ruby orbs turned toward each other ever so slightly. This revealed their owner, or should I say owners. My dad told me later how frightened he became once he realized that not only were there 2 creatures stalking him that night, but also how big they were. Each one must have stood well over 6 feet tall, judging by size alone. Plus, who knows how much bigger they were, yet still hidden behind underbrush, obstructing a clear view beneath. There wasn't any doubt left anymore whatsoever about what these things actually were. After witnessing both bodies move simultaneously, causing the brush overhead to shake violently, everything clicked inside his head. He screamed before quickly taking cover amongst the nearest set of trees surrounding the property line. This stretched far beyond the vision range ahead. He never looked back either.